As the evening moved forward, Margaret noticed how easily conversations formed without her. Rachel stood near the patio heater, describing renovation ideas in a voice that carried just enough to reach the guests closest to the dessert table. She spoke about widening doorways, installing railings, converting the upstairs guest room into something more practical. Each suggestion was wrapped in concern, framed as thoughtful planning for comfort and safety. Margaret remained by the buffet, refilling glasses and straightening napkins that did not need straightening. She had learned long ago that silence was not weakness. It was observation. Daniel drifted between groups, nodding along as Rachel painted a picture of future adjustments. "It is just about making things easier," Rachel said, smiling brightly. 72 is still young, but we have to think ahead. A few neighbors nodded sympathetically. Margaret caught the glance of her longtime friend Carol, who looked puzzled but said nothing. The cake was cut at exactly 7:45 in the evening. Rachel insisted on holding the knife with Margaret, guiding her hand for the photographs. The flash from several phones lit up the yard, freezing Margaret's expression into something that would look joyful later on social media. She wondered which caption Rachel would choose. Something about gratitude, perhaps. Something about family support. As plates were passed around, Margaret overheard a quiet exchange near the gift table. "We are hoping she will consider moving closer to us," Rachel said to one of Daniel's coworkers. "The house is a lot to manage alone." Margaret glanced toward the two-story colonial behind them. She had scrubbed its floors herself when Daniel was a boy. She had painted the shutters in the spring heat and shoveled the driveway in winters when snow reached 12 inches deep. Manage alone. The phrase echoed calmly in her mind. When Daniel finally sat beside her on one of the folding chairs, he kept his voice low. "Mom, do not take any of this the wrong way," he said, staring at the paper plate balanced on his knees. "Rachel just worries." Margaret studied her son's profile, noticing how similar it still looked to the 8-year-old who once clung to her hand on his first day of school. "I am not offended," she replied softly. And she meant it. Offense required surprise. What she felt instead was clarity. She saw how the narrative was being shaped around her, how gently and publicly her independence was being rewritten into dependence. Across the yard, Rachel laughed at something someone said, the sound light and confident. The string lights flickered as the sun dipped below the neighboring rooftops, casting longer shadows across the grass. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and listened to the hum of conversation, fully aware that the celebration unfolding around her was not only about another year of life. It was about control, perception, and the quiet assumption that she would eventually step aside. She did not correct anyone. She did not raise her voice. She simply continued to watch, measuring each word and each smile, as carefully as she once measured flour and sugar in the kitchen that now felt less and less like the center of the evening. By 8:30 the sky had turned a deep blue, and the backyard lights seemed almost theatrical against the quiet suburban street. Guests began gathering their purses and light jackets, thanking Rachel for the invitation as if she were the hostess of a charity event rather than a daughter-in-law at someone else's home. Margaret stood near the back door now, offering polite goodbyes and steady eye contact, her voice warm but measured. She noticed how often Rachel answered questions directed at her. When a neighbor asked Margaret whether she planned to travel this winter, Rachel stepped in smoothly. "We are thinking Florida might be easier for her," she said, placing a guiding hand at Margaret's elbow. "Less maintenance, smaller space." Margaret did not pull away. She simply looked at the neighbor and replied, "I have not finalized my plans yet." The word finalized lingered in the air, subtle but deliberate. As the crowd thinned, Daniel began stacking folding chairs, moving quickly as if eager to finish. The cake plates were scraped clean, the three-tiered confection reduced to crumbs and smudges of raspberry filling. Margaret carried a tray of empty glasses into the kitchen, listening to the muffled conversation drifting in from the patio. "She cannot keep up with a house this size forever," Rachel was saying, her tone lower now, but still confident. "We just have to be practical." Margaret set the tray down beside the sink and glanced around the familiar room. The oak cabinets still held the faint scratch Daniel made when he was 10 and practicing with. A pocket knife he was not supposed to have. The refrigerator hummed softly, magnets holding decades of holiday cards and report cards in place. Practical. The word felt tidy and efficient, stripped of sentiment. When she stepped back outside, only a handful of guests remained. Carol approached her quietly. "Are you all right?" she asked in a low voice. Margaret nodded. "I am exactly as I should be," she answered. And she was. The evening had clarified something that had been forming for months. It was not about one speech or one banner. It was about authorship. Rachel was attempting to rewrite the narrative of Margaret's life in front of an audience, to cast her as fragile, grateful, dependent. Margaret had allowed it to unfold, not because she agreed, but because she needed to see how far it would go. When Daniel finally came to stand beside her, his shoulders slightly slumped, he avoided meeting her eyes again. "We just want what is best for you," he said. Margaret studied him for a moment, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way he seemed to brace for resistance that never came. "I know," she replied calmly. The remaining lights flickered as someone unplugged an extension cord near the fence. The yard fell quieter, the laughter replaced by the distant sound of a passing car and the rustle of leaves. Margaret folded her arms lightly across her sweater and looked at her son and his wife, fully aware that they believed the evening had established something permanent. What they did not understand was that she had been establishing something as well, something less visible but far more decisive. When the last car pulled away and the red glow of tail lights disappeared at the end of the street, Margaret remained standing in the yard for a moment longer, breathing in the cool night air as if committing it to memory. Daniel and Rachel were gathering the final decorations near the fence, speaking in low voices that carried just enough for her to catch fragments about storage bins and returning rental chairs in the morning. Margaret stepped inside without announcing herself and turned on the kitchen light. The room felt different now that it was quiet, as though the house itself had been listening all evening. She removed her pearl necklace and set it carefully on the counter beside the sink, then began rinsing plates even though there were only a few left. Rachel entered a minute later, heels clicking against the tile. "You do not have to clean up tonight," she said lightly. "You should rest." Margaret dried her hands with a dish towel and faced her daughter-in-law with a calm expression. "I am not tired," she replied. Rachel hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "We were just talking about what might make things easier going forward," she continued, her tone measured. "The house, the stairs, all of it." Margaret nodded slowly, as if considering a practical suggestion about replacing an appliance. "I appreciate concern," she said. "Concern can be useful when it is invited." Rachel offered a tight smile, not quite sure how to interpret the response. Daniel appeared in the doorway, glancing between them. "Mom, we just want to make sure you are comfortable," he added. Margaret studied her son carefully. She saw not cruelty but avoidance, a willingness to let someone else speak on his behalf. "Comfort has many definitions," she said evenly. "Independence is one of them." The room fell quiet again. Rachel cleared her throat and picked up a stack of paper plates. "We can talk more later," she said. Margaret watched them carry boxes out to the garage, their movements brisk and efficient. When they finally left for the night, promising to call the next day, the house settled into its familiar rhythm. Margaret walked slowly through each room, turning off lights and straightening picture frames. She paused at the staircase Rachel had mentioned earlier, running her hand along the polished banister Daniel's father had installed himself decades ago. The wood was solid, steady beneath her palm. She climbed the steps without hesitation, counting them as she had done countless times before. 12 steps to the landing, then 4 more to the hallway. At the top, she turned and looked down at the darkened living room, aware that conversations about her future had been conducted as if she were already fading into the background. She did not feel faded. She felt alert. In her bedroom, she sat at the small writing desk near the window and opened a leather-bound planner. She flipped past the current week and paused at a date she had circled earlier that month. An appointment already made. A decision already in motion. Margaret closed the planner gently and turned off the lamp, her expression composed in the darkness, fully aware that while others had been discussing her next chapter, she had quietly begun writing it herself. The next morning the house felt unusually still, as though it were waiting for something to be said aloud. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains, illuminating faint traces of powdered sugar left on the counter from the night before. Margaret rose at 6:30 as she always did, brewed her coffee, and carried the mug to the small table by the window. The yard looked ordinary again, the folding chairs gone, the banner removed, no evidence of the conversations that had quietly reshaped her in the eyes of others. She opened her planner once more and confirmed the appointment circled in blue ink. 10 o'clock. Henderson and Blake, attorneys at law. She had scheduled it 3 weeks earlier, after noticing how often Rachel used phrases like transition plan and long-term solution. At the time, Margaret had not reacted emotionally. She had reacted strategically. She finished her coffee, washed the mug, and chose a navy blazer from her closet, the same one she used to wear for parent-teacher conferences. By 9:15 she was in her sedan, driving past familiar streets lined with maple trees, just beginning to turn gold. The law office occupied a modest brick building near the downtown square, across from a bakery that had been there for over 20 years. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Margaret checked in, her posture straight, her expression composed. When Mr. Henderson invited her into his office, she took a seat and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I would like to review my estate documents," she said without hesitation. "And I would like to establish a trust that ensures my home remains under my control unless I personally decide otherwise." The attorney listened carefully, asking precise questions. Margaret answered each one with clarity. She outlined her assets, her savings, the house that had been paid off a decade earlier. She explained that she wanted no ambiguity about decision-making authority, no room for interpretation. Mr. Henderson nodded and began outlining options in calm, professional language. As he spoke about trustees, beneficiaries, and durable powers of attorney, Margaret felt something settle into place inside her. This was not an act of defiance. It was an act of definition. By the time she signed the preliminary paperwork, nearly an hour had passed. She did not rush. She read every line. When she stepped back outside, the church clock down the street chimed 11. Margaret paused on the sidewalk, adjusting her blazer in the reflection of the office window. She did not feel angry. She felt prepared. On the drive home, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Just checking in to see how you are feeling today." Margaret read it at a red light and allowed herself a faint smile. She typed a brief response. "I am feeling clear," she wrote. Then she placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and continued driving, fully aware that while others believed they were guiding her future for her own good, she had quietly ensured that her future would remain exactly where it belonged, in her own steady hands. 2 days later, Daniel stopped by in the late afternoon, alone this time, his sedan pulling into the driveway, just as Margaret finished watering the front hydrangeas. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn, and the air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. Margaret turned off the hose, coiled it carefully against the side of the house, and greeted her son with the same calm composure she had shown at the party. Daniel looked tired, as if he had rehearsed a conversation during the entire drive over. They sat at the kitchen table where Margaret had once helped him with math homework, the wood surface still marked by faint impressions of pencil lines from decades ago. Daniel cleared his throat and folded his hands. "Rachel and I have been thinking more about what we discussed," he began. "About making things simpler for you." Margaret poured 2 glasses of iced tea before sitting down across from him. "Simpler can mean many things," she replied evenly. Daniel nodded, then continued, "We talked to a realtor. Just to get an idea. Houses in this neighborhood are selling quickly. It might be a good time." Margaret did not react outwardly. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the silence stretch long enough to shift the weight of the moment back onto him. "And who would be selling the house?" she asked gently. Daniel hesitated. "Well, eventually, it would be a family decision." Margaret set her glass down with deliberate care. "It is not a family decision," she said, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "It is my decision." Daniel leaned back in his chair, surprised by the clarity in her tone. He had expected resistance, perhaps emotion. What he encountered instead was certainty. "We just do not want you to struggle," he insisted. Margaret held his gaze. "Struggle is assuming I cannot manage what I have managed for 30 years, she replied. "Concern is asking me what I want before planning what I should do." The distinction hung between them like a line drawn quietly across the table. Daniel rubbed his forehead, clearly uncomfortable. "Rachel feels like you are pushing us away," he said. Margaret allowed a faint, almost sympathetic smile. "Independence is not rejection," she answered. "It is responsibility." She reached for a small folder resting beside her on the table, one she had placed there intentionally before he arrived. She did not open it yet. She simply rested her hand on top of it, a subtle signal that something had shifted. Daniel noticed. "What is that?" he asked. Margaret's expression remained composed. "Clarity," she replied. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees, scattering a few dry leaves across the driveway. Inside the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filled the pause that followed. Daniel sensed that the narrative he and Rachel had begun constructing was no longer unfolding according to their design. Margaret was not defensive. She was prepared. And as she sat across from her son in the house, she owned outright, her posture straight and her voice measured. It became evident that whatever conversation came next would not be guided by assumption, but by decisions she had already quietly put into motion. Daniel looked at the folder beneath Margaret's hand, as if it might contain something fragile, something that could shift the balance of the room with a single sentence. He did not reach for it. He waited. Margaret noticed the hesitation and decided not to prolong it. She opened the folder slowly and turned it so he could see the first page, neatly printed on heavy cream paper with a legal letterhead at the top. "I met with an attorney this week," she said in the same calm tone she once used to explain a lesson plan. Daniel blinked, clearly unprepared for that development. "An attorney?" he repeated. Margaret nodded. "Yes, I have established a revocable living trust. The house has been transferred into it. I remain the sole trustee." She allowed the words to settle before continuing. "No sale, no refinancing, no structural changes can occur without my written authorization." Daniel stared at the document, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to realization. "Mom, we were not trying to force anything," he said quickly. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. "Intent does not erase momentum," she replied. "You and Rachel began discussing my future as if it were a group project. It is not." The refrigerator hummed behind her, steady and ordinary, underscoring the stillness of the moment. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Rachel just worries about liability, about you falling, about expenses." Margaret folded the folder closed and rested her palms lightly on top of it. "Then she can worry," she said gently. "Worry does not grant authority." The distinction was quiet but unmistakable. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair the way he had as a teenager when confronted with consequences he had not anticipated. "Why did you not tell us you were doing this?" he asked. Margaret's gaze softened, though her posture remained firm. "Because you did not tell me you were speaking to a realtor," she answered. The symmetry of that response left little room for argument. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, its engine fading down the street. Life continued at its normal pace, indifferent to the recalibration happening inside the kitchen. "This does not mean I am shutting you out," Margaret added after a moment. "It means I am drawing a boundary." Daniel sat back, absorbing the shift in language. Boundary was not a word he had associated with his mother before. She had always been accommodating, generous, willing to adjust. Now she appeared measured, intentional. "Rachel is not going to like this," he said quietly. Margaret allowed a small, almost reflective smile. "This decision was not made for Rachel to like," she replied. "It was made for me to live with." The late afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating the familiar kitchen in a way that felt both ordinary and newly defined. Daniel realized, perhaps for the first time, that the conversation was no longer about what might happen someday. It was about what had already been. Secured. Margaret rose from her chair, placing the folder back inside the cabinet beside her desk. The gesture was simple, controlled, final. And in that quiet movement, it became clear that the direction of her life would no longer be negotiated in her absence. Daniel left just before sunset, his movements slower than when he arrived, as if the weight of new information had altered his posture. Margaret watched from the front window as his car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet suburban street. She did not feel triumph. She felt alignment. The conversation had not been loud, but it had been decisive. Inside the house, everything remained exactly where it had been the week before, yet the atmosphere felt subtly different, steadier. Margaret walked into the living room and sat in her late husband's armchair, folding her hands in her lap. The trust documents were no longer on the kitchen table. They were secured, filed properly, protected by both law and intention. Her phone vibrated against the side table. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. Margaret allowed it to ring twice before answering. "Hello, Rachel," she said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, then a controlled voice. "Daniel told me about the paperwork," Rachel began. "I wish we had discussed it first." Margaret listened without interruption. "You were discussing realtors," she replied evenly. "We are both capable of making appointments." The silence that followed carried more meaning than raised voices ever could. Rachel shifted her tone. "We were only trying to help," she insisted. Margaret's response was measured. Help begins with asking what someone wants, not deciding what they should surrender. She did not accuse. She did not apologize. She simply stated the boundary again in clear language. Rachel exhaled audibly. "So what happens now?" she asked. Margaret glanced around the living room, at the framed photographs, the bookshelf, the staircase visible through the hallway. "Now," she said, "we continue as a family." With clarity, she ended the call gently, placing the phone back on the table without tension. That evening she prepared a simple dinner for herself, grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, setting one plate at the dining table as she always had. The house did not feel empty. It felt quiet in a way that allowed her thoughts to settle. She reviewed her finances after dinner, logging into her bank account, confirming balances, ensuring automatic payments were current. Independence was not a declaration. It was maintenance. As the clock approached 9:30, she locked the front door and turned off the porch light. Upstairs, she paused again at the top of the staircase, looking down at the hallway below. She understood that Rachel would likely adjust her approach, perhaps become more cautious, perhaps more subtle. That was no longer Margaret's concern. She had shifted the structure of the conversation from assumption to authorization. In doing so, she had altered the direction of future discussions without raising her voice once. When she turned off the bedroom lamp and settled beneath the covers, she did not replay the tension of the day. She thought instead about the years ahead, years she intended to define on her own terms. Outside, the neighborhood remained still, unaware that within one quiet house, the balance of authority had been firmly and respectfully reclaimed. 3 weeks passed with an almost deliberate calm. Daniel still called on Sundays, though his tone carried a new caution, as if he were navigating a room that had been quietly rearranged. Rachel sent polite messages, carefully worded, asking about the weather, about church, about whether Margaret needed anything from the grocery store. Margaret noticed the shift immediately. The urgency had softened. The assumptions had retreated. On a crisp Saturday morning in early October, Margaret hosted a small brunch for a few friends from church, setting out fresh fruit, warm biscuits, and a pot of coffee that filled the house with a familiar scent. She did not mention the trust or the conversations that had followed the birthday gathering. She did not need to. Her posture, her tone, her steady presence spoke clearly enough. After her guests left, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking around as if seeing the space differently. "It looks good in here," he said quietly. Margaret smiled. "It always has." He nodded, then took a seat at the table without being invited, a habit from childhood that she had never corrected. "Rachel and I talked," he began. "We may have moved too fast." Margaret folded the dish towel in her hands and placed it neatly beside the sink. "You were planning," she said. "Planning without me." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I did not realize how that felt from your side." Margaret pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her movements unhurried. "It felt like I was being summarized," she replied, "reduced to a problem to solve." The honesty in her voice was calm, not accusatory. Daniel met her eyes this time. "You are not a problem," he said firmly. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Then treat me as a person with authority over her own life." The conversation did not escalate. It settled. Daniel nodded once, absorbing the correction not as a reprimand, but as instruction. Outside, a light wind moved through the trees, scattering a few dry leaves across the driveway that Margaret would sweep later at her own pace. "We want to support you," Daniel said after a moment. Margaret allowed herself a faint, genuine smile. "Support stands beside," she answered. "It does not steer." The distinction seemed to reach him in a way previous explanations had not. He stood, stepped around the table, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I am proud of you," he said quietly. Margaret looked up at her son, seeing not resistance, but recognition. "You should be proud of yourself," she replied, "for listening." When he left that afternoon, the house did not feel like a battleground reclaimed. It felt like a boundary respected. Margaret returned to her desk and opened her planner, adding a note for the coming spring about repainting the shutters herself. The decision was simple, practical, entirely her own. Outside, the neighborhood continued its steady rhythm, unaware that the most significant shift had not been loud or dramatic. It had been a quiet correction of power, carried out with composure, secured with clarity, and maintained without raising a single voice.